The white fox had no reason to be there. That was the first thing Lena noticed. The wrongness of it. The way the small creature sat in the middle of the frozen path, as if it had been waiting for her specifically. As if the entire vast and indifferent tundra had conspired to place it exactly there, in exactly that moment, when she had nowhere left to go and no one left to turn to. She stopped walking. The wind howled across the valley below, carrying ice crystals that bit at her exposed cheeks. And the fox simply looked at her with eyes the color of pale winter sky, calm and ancient and utterly unafraid. Lena had lived on the northern frontier her entire life. She knew every animal that roamed these territories, every track in the snow, every call that echoed between the frozen peaks at night. She had never seen a white Arctic fox. Not once. The elders said they were gone. Extinct. A story told to children about a time when the world was different and the blood of the North ran. Stronger and purer through the veins of those who guarded it. She took one step forward. The fox did not run. "You should not be here," she said aloud, her breath a cloud of white vapor that dissolved instantly into the bitter air. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too loud against the silence of the valley. The fox tilted its head. There was something in that small motion that made the back of her neck prickle, something that felt less like an animal reacting to sound and more like a person acknowledging a statement they found interesting. She shook the thought away. She was tired. She'd been awake since before dawn, making the long trek to the ridge caves where the frost root herbs grew, and the cold had a way of making the mind produce images and meanings where there were none. She took another step, intending to walk around the creature and continue down the path toward the settlement. The fox moved, not away, alongside her. 3 steps to her left, matching her pace. Exactly. Its white fur almost invisible against the snow except for those pale blue eyes that kept returning to her face with an expression she had no word for. Lena stopped again. "Go away," she said. It was not unkind. She had never been unkind to animals, had spent most of her life preferring their company to that of the pack members, who looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt that she had learned to ignore, but never quite learned not to feel. The fox sat down in the snow and looked at her. She stared back at it for a long moment, then pulled her coat tighter and resumed walking. The fox walked with her, all the way down the ridge, all the way across the frozen valley floor where the wind was worst, and the ice cracked under her boots in ways that always made her stomach drop even though she had crossed it hundreds of times. All the way to the outer fence of Voss settlement, where it finally stopped, sitting at the edge of the boundary markers as if it understood the line it was not meant to cross. Lena looked back at it once before she pushed through the gate. The fox watched her go. She did not understand why that felt like something important. She understood even less why it was there again the next morning. The settlement was in an uproar that had nothing to do with foxes or frontier paths, or the strange prickling sensation that had not quite left the back of her neck since the day before. She heard it before she saw it, the raised voices and the sound of boots. On frozen ground, moving with urgency, the particular quality of noise that a community makes when something significant has happened and everyone is simultaneously trying to find out more information and pretend they already knew. She paused at the entrance to the main square and grabbed the arm of Petra, the baker's daughter, who was hurrying past with wide eyes and a loaf of bread pressed against her chest like a shield. "What is happening?" Lena asked. Petra looked at her with an expression that managed to combine excitement and a very specific kind of social pleasure that people took in delivering important news. "The king is coming," she said. "Alpha King called her. He sent advance riders this morning. He will be here by midday." The words landed in Lena's chest with a weight that surprised her. She released Petra's arm and let the girl rush off, standing still while the settlement moved around her in waves of preparation and anxiety. The king. She had never seen him. Few people in the frontier settlements had. He ruled from the Iron Citadel in the deep north, a place so cold that only those with the strongest lichen blood could survive its winters. And he governed the 7 pack territories with a combination of military precision and political intelligence that had maintained peace for longer than most people could remember. She knew his name. Everyone knew his name. Calder Voss. The last Iron King. The one who had ended the border wars before she was born, and who had not, in all the years since, given anyone sufficient reason to start them again. He was, by all accounts, a man who did not make mistakes. She had always imagined such a person as something more symbol than human, more concept than flesh. The idea that he would arrive in her settlement, in this forgotten outpost at the edge of everything, before midday today, made the world feel suddenly and uncomfortably small. She had work to do. She went to do it. The healing house was at the far edge of the settlement, which suited everyone involved. Pack members came to Lena when they needed her, and avoided her when they did not, which was the arrangement she had accepted long ago as the closest thing to normal her life was likely to offer. She had no wolf. That was the fundamental fact around which everything else in her life organized itself. Every member of a Lycan pack was meant to carry a wolf within them, the inner animal that was their birthright, and their bond to the pack hierarchy, the thing that determined their rank and their place and their worth in the eyes of everyone around them. Lena had turned 18 and felt nothing. No awakening, no shift, no silver eyes in the mirror or heat beneath her skin on a full moon. Nothing. The pack healer at the time had examined her and delivered the verdict with the efficient kindness of someone communicating a diagnosis that was not a surprise. Omega status. No wolf manifest. She would serve the pack in whatever capacity her other skills allowed. She had gone back to her small room in the healing house and sat with the information for 3 days before she decided that it was simply the shape of her life, and she would live it anyway. That had been 6 years ago. She was good at her work. She knew more about medicinal herbs and wound treatment and fever management than anyone else in the settlement, possibly more than anyone in the 3 nearest territories. She had read every text the settlement library possessed on the subject and had written to healers in other regions for information they did not have. When people were sick or injured, they came to her, and she helped them. And for the duration of those interactions, she was not the Omega, without a wolf, but simply the person who knew what to do. She had built something out of the material she had been given. She had decided, very deliberately and at considerable personal cost, to be proud of it. Most days she succeeded. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The advance riders arrived first, 6 of them on horses with the Voss sigil on their saddlecloths, black wolves against a field of deep gray. They spoke with Elder Harmon, the settlement's nominal leader, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, who had the permanently worried expression of someone who had spent decades managing a community at the edge of civilization, and had never quite gotten used to it. Lena watched from the door of the healing house as they dismounted and gestured at various parts of the settlement with the brisk efficiency of people preparing a space for someone whose requirements were non-negotiable. She went back inside. She had 3 patients to check on: a child with a chest infection, an older man whose frostbite from a hunting accident 2 weeks ago was healing slowly but correctly, and a young woman who had sprained her ankle badly enough that Lena had insisted she stay off it for another 4 days at minimum, despite the woman's insistence that she was perfectly fine. She made her rounds. She checked her herb stores. She reorganized the preparation table for the 3rd time that week, which was something she did when she was unsettled and needed her hands to have something useful to do. The king arrived at midday, precisely. She heard the change in the settlement noise from inside the healing house, the way it shifted from busy preparation to a different kind of silence, the held breath quality that a community produced when something it had been anticipating finally became real. She told herself she was not going to go look. She stayed at her preparation table for another 4 minutes, measuring dried frost root into small cloth packets with careful attention. And then she put down the packets and walked to the door and looked. He was not what she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. Something more overtly ceremonial, perhaps. More clearly constructed for the purpose of inspiring awe. What rode into the settlement square, was a man on a dark horse, flanked by a guard of 12, but not hidden by them, dressed in practical riding clothes of heavy charcoal wool and dark leather, rather than anything that announced rank through ornamentation. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with the particular quality of stillness that very physically powerful people sometimes possessed, as if their bodies had learned early that they did not need to perform strength because the fact of it was already obvious to everyone in the vicinity. His hair was dark, close-cropped at the sides, slightly longer on top, and his face was the kind of face that had been arranged by genetics into something striking without apparently making any effort about it. All strong lines and a jaw that looked like it had been designed specifically to communicate that its owner was not a person who entertained frivolous arguments. He dismounted in a single fluid motion and spoke to Elder Harmon without any preamble that she could observe from this distance. And the elder nodded with the expression of a man who was trying very hard to appear as though receiving the Alpha King was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday occurrence. Lena went back inside. She stayed there for the rest of the afternoon, treating patients, preparing medicines, doing every task she could identify that needed doing. The settlement hummed around the King's presence like a body around a foreign object, reorganizing itself in subtle ways to accommodate the new center of gravity. She did not join the gathering that she knew was happening in the main hall. She had not been invited, and even if she had been, her absence from settlement social occasions was established enough that no one would notice or remark on it. She was the healer. She was useful. She stayed in her useful place and did not think about the rider on the dark horse and the strange quality of his stillness, and she succeeded at this for almost exactly 2 hours before Elder Harmon knocked on her door. "The King requests the settlement's healer," he said, when she opened it. His expression was carefully neutral, in the way that meant he had opinions about this development that he had decided it would not be politically wise to share. "One of his guards sustained an injury on the road. Nothing serious, I am told, but he wants it properly treated." "Of course," she said. She got her kit. The main hall had been rearranged since that morning, the long communal tables pushed to the sides to create a more formal space. The settlement's best lanterns lit despite the fact that it was still hours before true darkness. The King's party occupied one end of the hall, with the efficient economy of people accustomed to making any space function as temporary headquarters. She noticed Lady Vivienne Ashford before she noticed anyone else, which she suspected was the point. That woman was extraordinary in the way that a weapon is extraordinary, beautiful and deliberate, and communicating its purpose through every detail of its construction. She stood at the King's left hand in a gown of deep blue that had no business being this far north in this season, her dark hair arranged with architectural precision, her expression a masterwork of composed attention that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and evaluating. She was, Lena knew from the few pieces of information that reached even frontier settlements, the daughter of Lord Ashford of the Eastern Territory and the King's primary political advisor. She was also, according to the same sources, widely expected to become his queen before the year's end. Looking at her, Lena could not find a single reason why this would not be exactly what happened. The injured guard was easy to find. He was sitting on a bench near the far wall, with his right hand wrapped in a cloth that was doing an inadequate job of managing what appeared, as she got closer, to be a significant laceration across his palm and the base of 2 fingers. She crossed the hall with her kit, aware of being looked at without allowing that awareness to change her pace or expression, and crouched in front of the guard. "I am the settlement healer," she said. "May I see your hand?" He unwrapped the cloth, and she examined the injury with the focused attention that made everything else temporarily irrelevant. It was deep, but clean. No tendon. Involvement that she could see. She would need to suture it properly. She began organizing her kit with practiced efficiency, asking the guard brief questions about sensation and movement in his fingers, and for several minutes there was only the work and the guard's stoic answers, and the small particular sounds of medical treatment. "You are very calm," said a voice above her. She looked up. The King was standing 3 feet away, watching her work with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Up close, he was even more simply and uncomplicatedly present than he had seemed across the square. The kind of person whose physical reality left no room for the mental image you had constructed in advance. His eyes were gray, she noticed. A very specific shade of gray that made her think involuntarily of frozen lakes just before the thaw, when the ice was still solid, but you could see the dark water moving beneath it. Most people become less precise when they are being observed, he said. His voice was quiet, lower than she expected, and held a particular quality that she recognized after a moment as genuine curiosity rather than any kind of test. You became more precise. I became more precise because there is a person in pain who needs this wound properly closed, she said, because it was true, and then realized a half-second later that she had just spoken to the Alpha King of the North in the tone she used to explain basic medical logic to people who were making her work harder than it needed to be. She felt the guard tense slightly under her hands. She finished the suture she was on with steady fingers. "I am sorry," she said. That was direct to the point of rudeness. It was direct to the point of honesty, the king said. "I find I prefer it." He was still watching her. She was aware of it the way you were aware of a fire in a cold room, not uncomfortably, but in a way that was impossible to ignore. "What is your name?" "Lena," she said. "Lena Voss." A pause. She added, because it would come out eventually if it had not already. "Omega status, no wolf manifest. I serve the settlement as its healer." Something moved in his gray eyes that she could not read. "Lena Voss," he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. "You share the family name of the territory." "It is a common name in the north," she said. "It means nothing particular." She tied off the final suture and began wrapping the guard's hand with clean binding cloth. "Your man will need to keep this dry and change the dressing daily. I will leave supplies and instructions. The stitches should come out in 10 days if there is no sign of infection. He should have full use of the hand within 3 weeks." She looked up at the guard. "Do you have any questions?" He shook his head, looking slightly dazed in a way that she suspected had less to do with the injury, and more to do with the fact that she had just spoken to the king with the brisk efficiency of someone conducting a routine consultation. She packed her kit. She stood. She looked at Calder Voss and found him still watching her with that expression she could not name. "If there is nothing else required," she said, "I will return to the healing house." "There is one thing," he said. He tilted his head slightly, and the motion was so unexpectedly reminiscent of something that it took her a full 2 seconds to identify it. It was the same motion the fox had made. Yesterday, on the path, when she had said it. Should not be there. The exact same angle, the exact same quality of attention. "I was told that a white fox has been seen following you across the valley." The hall was not particularly loud, but it became more quiet. She noticed Lady Vivienne's attention sharpen from across the room, becoming something more focused and less decorative. "One fox," she said carefully. "I encountered it on the ridge path yesterday. It followed me to the settlement boundary." "And this morning?" She paused. "It was there again when I left at dawn. It followed me to the boundary again." She kept her voice level. "I do not know why. I have no explanation for it." "No," the king said softly. He was looking at her in a way that made the back of her neck prickle exactly as it had the day before on the ridge. "Neither do I. Yet." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for any conversational purpose she could identify. "Thank you for treating my man, healer." She left the hall. She walked back to the healing house through the cold evening air and stood inside it for a long time without lighting the lamp, listening to her own heartbeat, which was doing something unusual that she attributed to the unaccustomed strangeness of the day and nothing else whatsoever. She was almost convinced by this explanation by the time she fell asleep. The fox was at the gate when she opened it the next morning, not at the boundary markers where it had stopped the previous 2 days. At the gate itself, sitting on the inside of the settlement fence, which meant it had come through at some point in the night without anyone seeing or stopping it. Which should not have been possible given that the settlement maintained boundary wards specifically designed to keep animals out of the inhabited area during winter. She stared at it. It stared back at her. "How did you get in here?" she asked. It blinked its pale blue eyes with an air of supreme unconcern, and then stood and walked toward her with its tail held high in the manner of a cat making a social call. And she found herself, despite every reasonable objection she could formulate, reaching down to let it sniff her fingers. It pressed its cold nose against her knuckles for a moment, then rubbed the side of its face against her hand in a gesture so precisely like a greeting that her throat did something strange. "You cannot stay here," she told it. "You are an Arctic fox. You belong on the tundra." The fox sat down on her foot. She was still standing there, engaged in a one-sided argument with an animal whose position on the matter appeared to be settled, when she became aware that she was being watched. She looked up. The king was leaning against the outer wall of the building across the narrow lane, arms crossed, in the same practical riding clothes he had worn the day before, watching her and the fox with an expression that was the first openly unguarded thing she had seen on his face. It was not quite a smile. It was something adjacent to wonder, she thought. The expression of a person encountering something they had not expected, and finding themselves genuinely uncertain what to do with it. "How long has it been doing that?" he asked, nodding at the fox, which had now moved from her foot to pressed against her ankle in the manner of a devoted dog. "Following me?" 2 days, she said. She straightened up carefully, not wanting to disturb the fox, which seemed ridiculous, and then decided that her instincts on this occasion were probably as good as her logic. "Being inside the settlement wards? This appears to be a new development as of this morning. The boundary wards on this settlement were laid by my grandfather," he said, and there was something careful in his voice now, something that was controlling itself. "They respond to blood recognition. Only those with pack blood can pass them freely." The words settled into the cold morning air between them. She heard them. She understood their grammatical structure and their individual component parts perfectly well. She did not immediately understand what they were telling her. "That is not possible," she said. "Arctic foxes do not have pack blood. They are ordinary animals." "Arctic white foxes," he said, "are not ordinary animals. They have not been seen in the north since the fall of the Guardian bloodline 300 years ago." He pushed off from the wall and walked toward her, and there was something different in how he moved now, something deliberate and intent that was different from the controlled stillness she had observed the day before. He stopped a few feet from her. The fox looked up at him, and then, to her absolute astonishment, made a sound she had never heard an Arctic fox make, something between a chirp and a hum, low and resonant, before pressing itself more firmly against her ankle. The king crouched down to the fox's level and looked at it for a long moment. When he looked up at her, his gray eyes had the quality she now recognized, the frozen lake quality, dark movement beneath a controlled surface. "Tell me about your parents," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I do not have parents," she said. "I was left at the settlement when I was 2 years old. Elder Harmon took me in. No family name was known for me, so I was given the territory name, as is done with foundlings here." She kept her voice even with the practice of someone who had told this particular story, enough times that it had lost most of its capacity to cause her pain, though not, she had discovered, all of it. "There is nothing to tell. Foundlings in this territory are given the Voss name," he said, still in that quiet voice. "My name." He stood. He was looking at her with an intensity that she did not know how to hold without looking away, and she held it anyway because she had not survived 24 years as an Omega, in a lichen settlement by allowing herself to flinch from discomfort. "The white fox recognizes you," he said. "The boundary wards recognize you, and He paused. She watched something move across his face that he did not quite suppress in time. "I need to look into some records," he finished, and the careful control was back, and she was left with the distinct and destabilizing impression that he had stopped himself from saying something quite different. "Do not go to the ridge today," he said. "Stay within the settlement." It was not a request. She noticed this and decided to respond to it as if it were, because she was not yet sure what the alternative meant. "Of course," she said. He looked at her for one more moment, then walked away through the morning without another word. The fox looked after him, then looked up at her. "I do not know what is happening either," she told it. She went to work. "What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." She found out, in pieces, over the course of a day that felt longer than most weeks she had lived. Elder Harmon came to the healing house in the mid-morning with an expression she had never seen on his face before. A combination of guilt and something that might have been relief, at guilt finally having an appropriate outlet. He sat down in the chair she kept for patients and looked at his hands for a moment before looking at her. "There are things I should have told you years ago," he said. "I convinced myself I was protecting you. I am no longer certain that was the truth." She put down the herb she was preparing and sat down across from him and waited. He was not a man who could be rushed, and she had learned patience as a fundamental survival skill. The fox was curled on the floor near the small iron stove, asleep or performing an excellent imitation of sleep, its white tail wrapped around its nose. What Elder Harmon told her took most of an hour and required 2 cups of tea that she made, and he drank without appearing to notice. He told her that the woman who had brought her to the settlement had not been a stranger. She had been a Voss by blood, a distant branch of the family, one of the last surviving members of a line that had been methodically erased over 3 centuries by those who considered the old Guardian bloodline a political inconvenience. She had brought Lena to the settlement with wounds that she had not survived, and she had told him, with her last coherent hours, that the child had been hidden since birth because of what she was, and that she must continue to be hidden, and that her wolf must not be allowed to wake until she was safe. He had not understood what she meant. He had taken the child and given her a name, and kept the secret as he had been asked to keep it, because the dying woman had frightened him, and because the child had been 2 years old and had done nothing to deserve whatever danger had chased her mother to the frontier. He had never told anyone. He had watched Lena grow up and never manifest. A wolf, and told himself that perhaps the dying woman had been wrong, or delirious, or that whatever the child had been born with had simply not survived the early years. He had told himself, for 22 years, that the silence was kindness. She sat with what he had told her for a long time after he left. The fox uncurled from its place by the stove and came to sit beside her chair, pressing its warm, small body against her calf, and she reached down without thinking and rested her hand on its back. She could feel its heartbeat through the thick white fur, fast and steady, and somehow familiar in a way that had no rational basis. She thought about the word Elder Harmon had used, guardian. She thought about what the king had said about the white fox and the boundary wards and the bloodline that had vanished 300 years ago. She thought about 6 years of waking on every full moon and feeling nothing when everyone around her felt everything. She thought about the way the fox had looked at her on the ridge path, that calm, ancient recognition. And she thought about the king's gray eyes and the thing he had almost said and stopped himself, and the way he had looked at her with that expression she had not been able to name. And she thought that perhaps the name for it was the same word she was circling now, afraid to land on it because landing on it would mean that her life was an entirely different shape than she had understood it to be for 24 years. She did not get to sit with this for as long as she needed. The knock on the door came in the early afternoon, and when she opened it she found not the king, as some part of her had apparently been expecting, but Lady Vivian Ashford, who stood in the doorway with the composed elegance of a woman who had decided to make a social call and was very much not asking permission. She was wearing a different gown today, deep wine red this time, and a fur-lined cloak that probably cost more than the healing house's entire annual supply budget. She smiled when Lena opened the door, and it was a beautiful smile in the way that expensive things were beautiful, crafted and maintained, and communicating value rather than warmth. "May I come in?" she asked. Lena stepped back. The fox woke up from its place by the stove and looked at Lady Vivian with the particular focused attention of a small predator assessing something it had decided was relevant. Vivian looked at the fox, and something moved behind. Her controlled expression quickly suppressed. She sat in the chair Elder Harmon had occupied that morning, crossed her ankles, and looked at Lena with an evaluation that was thorough and unhurried, and made no attempt to disguise itself. "You treated his guard very well," she said. "I am told you are the best healer in 3 territories." "I do not know who told you that," Lena said, because it seemed important not to be managed into comfortable territory by compliments. "I know my work. Other healers in other territories know theirs." "Modesty is charming," Vivian said, and the lightness of her tone had a precise weight in it. "Though occasionally it is merely a different form of strategy." She held Lena's gaze. "He has been asking about you, since last night. He sent 2 of his people to the settlement records and another to the territory archive. He has not done that for a person since." A pause. "Since, never, in my experience of him, which is considerable." The fox made a sound. Not the chirp hum it had made for the king, something shorter and sharper. Vivian glanced at it. "That animal should not be here," she said. "It should not exist at all, according to every record that has been properly maintained." The emphasis on properly was delicate and deliberate. Someone has been careless with history. Or someone has been very careful with it, Lena said, and then was slightly surprised at herself for saying so. Vivian looked at her with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for the first time. "Yes," she said. "Exactly so." She rose, smoothing her cloak. "I came to tell you something that you may find useful to know. Calder Voss is a man who does what he believes is right. Not what is convenient, not what is politically advisable, not what those around him, including me, recommend when it conflicts with his judgment. He makes decisions very slowly, and then he does not unmake them." She paused at the door and looked back. "Whatever he is looking for in those records, he already knows what he will find. He has known since he saw you with that fox. Men like him do not ask questions to gather information. They ask questions to understand why the information they already have is true." She left. The fox watched the door close and then returned to its stove position with an air of having reached a verdict. Lena went back to work. She could not do anything else. Work had always been the architecture she built around things she could not yet hold, and she understood that she was not going to be able to hold any of this until she had more pieces, and the pieces were currently in the hands of a man going through records in some other part of the settlement. She changed the child's dressings, checked the older man's frostbite, delivered fresh pain medicine to the woman with the ankle, counted her supplies twice, and was in the middle of writing out instructions for the guard's wound care when the second knock came, and this time she knew, before she opened the door, he was alone. She noted this with the calm of someone who had decided in the last several hours to receive whatever was coming without flinching. He was carrying a leather document case, worn at the corners, which had the look of something that had traveled considerable distances. He stepped inside when she moved back from the door and looked at the space with the brief inventory gaze of someone who assessed rooms automatically. And then his eyes returned to her. "You need to sit down," he said. "Not because you cannot handle this standing, because it will take a while and sitting is more comfortable." She sat down. He placed the document case on the table and did not open it immediately. He sat in the chair across from her and looked at her in the direct way she had learned was simply how he looked at things. Fully, and without the social deflections that most people employed to make sustained attention feel less like examination. The fox padded over and sat between them like a moderator. "The Guardian bloodline," he said, "was not destroyed. The histories that say so were written by people who had reasons to want that believed. What actually happened was a dispersal. The last Guardian family split their line into 6 branches and sent them in 6 different directions with new names and instructions to keep what they were hidden until the time was right. He paused. What that time was meant to be, I did not know until this morning, when I found the correspondence between my great-great-grandfather and the last Guardian Elder. It was meant to be when the bond woke. He held her gaze. The Guardians and the Iron Line have been bound since the beginning of the North. Not politically, not through treaty, through blood and destiny, and a connection that neither line fully understood, but that both honored, because the North does not function without both of them. The Iron Line holds the territory. The Guardian Line holds the territory's heart. Without both, the balance fails. She was very still. She could hear the wind outside, and the fox's breathing and her own pulse, which was doing something measured and deliberate, as if her body had decided to be calm about this, so that her mind could catch up at its own pace. "You are telling me," she said carefully, "that you believe I am a Guardian. I am telling you that every piece of evidence available confirms it," he said. "The fox, the wards, your bloodline as traced through records. That your elder Harmon kept more carefully than he knew. Your name." His voice was very even. "I am also telling you something else." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him make a decision about something, a visible process, the control on his expression shifting slightly to accommodate what was below it. "When I saw you on the path with the fox, I felt a recognition that I have never felt for any other person in my life. My wolf recognized you before I did. That is what I could not say. This morning, because I did not yet have the information to understand it, and I do not make claims I cannot support." He met her eyes directly. The bond between the Guardian and the Iron King is not merely political. It never was. The records make that quite clear. The silence that followed was very full. The fox looked from one of them to the other with the air of an entity that had been waiting a very long time for this particular conversation, and was pleased to see it finally occurring. "Lady Vivienne," Lena said, after a moment that lasted several years inside her chest. "She is expecting to be your queen. She is expecting a political alliance that I have not agreed to," he said. "She expects many things with considerable efficiency. Some of them happen." Something shifted in his expression. Something that might have been the first edge of something wry, if it had been on almost anyone else's face. "I have not been unkind to her. I have also not made promises I did not intend to keep." He leaned forward slightly. "Are you afraid?" The question was direct and genuine, and completely without any quality of judgment. The kind of question that expected a true answer, rather than a comfortable one. She considered it seriously, because he deserved that. "I am afraid of things I do not understand," she said. "I spent 6 years believing something was wrong with me because my wolf did not wake. I built a life around that belief, and I am proud of what I built. I am afraid of what it means if the foundation of it was not what I thought it was." She paused. "I am not afraid of you." He was quiet for a moment. "You should know," he said, "that the Guardian wolf, when it wakes, does not wake as other wolves do. The records describe it as a dual nature, wolf and something older, something that predates the pack structure entirely." He looked at the fox. "The white fox is not your companion animal. It is your harbinger. It woke because you are about to wake." She felt something shift, deep in her chest, at those words. Not pain. Something more like the feeling of a door, long locked, beginning to move. "When?" she asked. "The solstice," he said. "In 3 days." She did not sleep well that night. This was not surprising. She lay in her narrow bed in the healing house with the fox curled at her feet, and stared at the ceiling, and tried to think clearly about what was happening, and found that her thoughts kept returning to his face, and the thing he had almost said on the first morning, and had finally said in the afternoon, and to the word recognition, and to the way it had felt to have someone look at her the way he had looked at her, not with pity, not with contempt, not with the particular combination of assessment and dismissal that she had come to expect as the baseline register of how people perceived her, but with something that saw her as already complete rather than perpetually lacking. She had not known, until it happened, how much. She had needed that. She had told herself for years that she did not need things from other people, that she had made her peace with her position, that the work was enough. It had been enough. She was not willing to say it had not been enough, because the life she had built was real, and it was hers, and she was not going to diminish it. But there was a difference, she was discovering, between a life that was enough and a life that was full, and she was beginning to understand that she had been living the first kind while telling herself it was the only kind available. The next 2 days moved with the strange double-time quality of days that contained too much significance, both too long and too brief, simultaneously. He came to the healing house each morning with the straightforward purposefulness of someone who had decided that this was where he intended to be, and they sat across from each other at the preparation table, and he asked her questions about her life and her work with the thorough attention of someone building a complete picture rather than gathering the polite minimum. And she answered him, gradually, and then less gradually, with more honesty than she had offered most people in the whole of her life. He told her things in return. Not the kind of public information that anyone in the North could have recited, but the actual texture of things, what it had been like to inherit the Iron King's position at 22, and understand immediately that the weight of it was not going to become lighter, but that he was going to have to become the kind of person for whom it was the right size. What it was like to govern 7 pack territories through the aftermath of wars that he had not started but had to end, understanding that every decision he made was experienced by hundreds of thousands of people as the difference between safety and danger, between their families being whole or broken. What it was like to be looked at by everyone as a symbol, and to have spent a long time understanding that the symbol was real and necessary, and not the same as the person inside it, and that both had to be maintained with equal care. She listened to him and understood, with a clarity that felt like something clicking into place, that what she had thought was distance when she looked at him from across the settlement square was not coldness. It was the same thing she recognized in herself, the careful management of a self that had been required to be useful before. It was allowed to be known. Lady Vivian watched these mornings with the precise attention of a chess player tracking a sequence of moves that had not yet fully resolved. She was not, Lena had decided, a simple antagonist. She was a complex person who had organized her life around a particular outcome, and who was intelligent enough to understand that outcomes could change, even while finding it extremely difficult to accept this in practice. She spoke to Lena twice more in those 2 days, and on both occasions the conversation was sharp and intelligent, and contained things that were genuinely useful, information about the political landscape that surrounded whatever was about to happen, the names and positions of people in the 7 territories who had reasons to resist the revival of the Guardian bloodline, the shape of the opposition that Lena would face if she was publicly recognized. "I am not your enemy," Vivian said, on the second evening, standing in the doorway of the healing house with the cold air coming in around her, and the setting sun making her extraordinary beauty look briefly human. "I am a person who wanted something, and am beginning to understand that I am not going to have it. Those are different things." She paused. "He would not have been miserable with me. I want you to know that. I would have been a good queen. I would have served the North well." "I believe you," Lena said, and meant it. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. "Do not waste what you have been given," she said. "Not the bloodline, the other thing." She left before Lena could respond. The fox watched her go with something that might have been respect. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The night before the solstice, she could not sleep at all. She lay still and breathed carefully, and felt the thing that had been moving in her chest for 3 days, building toward something she could not see clearly, but could feel the way. You felt weather coming, a pressure change, an alteration in the quality of the air, the knowledge that something large was approaching even before you could name its shape. The fox paced. She had never seen it pace. It moved in a small, tight circle at the foot of her bed with an agitation that was entirely at odds with its usual composure. And each circuit it made felt like a revolution of something larger. A counting down. A coiling. She finally gave up on sleep at the 3rd hour and got up, and dressed in the warmest clothes she owned and went outside. The settlement was quiet and dark. The solstice was the longest night of the year, and the sky above the frozen valley was extraordinary, a depth of black that made the stars look close enough to touch, the aurora beginning to move at the horizon in slow green ribbons that would be fully spectacular by midnight. She stood in the lane outside the healing house and breathed in the cold air and felt it down to the deepest part of her. Lungs. Felt the fox press against her leg. Felt the night on her skin like a living thing. She heard his footstep before she saw him. She knew it now, the particular weight and rhythm of it. He came around the corner of the building and stopped when he saw her, and for a moment they looked at each other across the dark lane in silence. He was wearing his riding clothes again, no ceremony in it, no performance, just him. "You felt it too," he said. It was not a question. "Something is coming," she said. "I do not know if I am ready." He crossed the lane and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth from him cutting through the cold. He looked out at the aurora on the horizon. "I have been Alpha King for 12 years, he said. "In that time, I have made decisions that determined the outcomes of battles and treaties and the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. I have never once been certain I was ready before I did any of it." He paused. Ready is not a condition that exists before necessary things. It is a condition that emerges during them, for people who are fundamentally capable. You are fundamentally capable, Lena. Every day of your life is evidence of that. She looked at him. The aurora was spreading across the sky now, green and silver, and its light moved across his face in a way that made him look, briefly and unexpectedly, like someone she had always known. "When this is over," she said carefully, measuring the words, "when whatever happens tonight happens and whatever follows it follows, I need you to understand something. I am not what I become tonight. I am also what I was before tonight. The healer. The person who built something out of what she was given and was proud of it." She paused. "I need whoever is standing beside me to know both of those things." He turned to look at her, and his gray eyes in the aurora light were open in a way she had not seen them before. The frozen lake in spring, the surface giving way to what moved beneath it. "I know both of those things," he said. "I have known them since I watched you treat my man's wound and become more precise when you were being observed." Something in his voice had changed. The careful control of it loosened enough to let the actual temperature of it through, and the temperature of it was very warm and entirely certain. "I am not standing beside you as a political decision," he said. "I want you to know that clearly." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. And she did. The fox made the chirp hum sound again, and despite everything, despite the weight of the night and what was coming, she felt her mouth move into something that was the realest smile she had produced in longer than she could measure. They were not standing close enough to touch. And then, quietly, they were. His hand found hers in the dark, and held it with the same quality of certainty as everything else about him. Not tentative, not questioning, simply present and sure. She let herself hold on. At midnight, the aurora filled the sky. She felt it begin the way you felt a first breath after a long time underwater. A rush, a clarity, a sudden enormous sense of expansion that had no pain in it, which was not what she had expected. She had feared pain. She had feared the violence of a transformation that had been suppressed for 24 years, finding its way out through whatever narrow passages were available to it. Instead, there was only light, interior and exterior. Simultaneously, the aurora overhead and something igniting beneath her skin that was not fire, but was the closest word she had for it, bright and alive and hungry and ancient and fundamentally, overwhelmingly, hers. She heard herself make a sound she had never made before. Not a cry. Something deeper. Something that came from a place that did not have a location in the body she usually inhabited. She felt Calder's hand grip hers tighter. She felt the fox lean against her leg with its whole small body, vibrating. And then, not gradually but all at once, she understood what she was. She was a guardian. She was the last of them, and the first of them again. And she carried in her blood 300 years of waiting, and a power that was older than the pack structure, older than the Iron King's line, something that predated the organized North entirely, and had been present in this land since before anyone had names for what they were. She could feel the territory. Not metaphorically. Literally, the way you felt your own heartbeat. She could feel the pulse of the frozen valley, and the ridge, and the distant peaks and the pack settlements scattered across the white expanse. All of it connected. All of it alive in a way she had always known intellectually, but had never felt from the inside. She could feel the pack bonds, the hundreds of connections between the people of the North and their wolves and each other, and she could feel, at the center of all of it, one bond that was different from the others, not because it was louder, but because it was the only one that ran in both directions equally, the only one she was both feeling and generating simultaneously. She turned and looked at Calder, and found him looking at her, and his eyes were silver, the full shift of an alpha's wolf coming to the surface, and she understood that what she saw on his face was what she felt in her own chest, recognition completed, something that had been waiting its entire existence for. This moment finally arriving at it. "There you are," he said softly. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The settlement woke in pieces to the aurora and to something else. Some quality in the air that those with wolf blood would feel in their bones and not be able to name immediately, but would know, in the way pack animals knew things through channels that were not language, was a shift in something fundamental. By dawn, people were gathering in the square, drawn by an instinct they could not have explained to anyone who asked. Elder Harmon came out of the settlement hall with an expression that was simultaneously the face of a man who had expected this for many years, and a man who was completely unprepared for it. The King's Guard stood at formation around the perimeter of the square. Lady Vivian stood near the east entrance in a posture of composed witness, her face unreadable, her presence carrying a quality that Lena, looking at her, recognized as a person fulfilling a role they have accepted even at personal cost, and she felt a complicated respect for that. Lena stood at the center of the square with the fox at her feet and Calder beside her. And she was not afraid. She had been afraid yesterday, and the day before, and every day for 6 years, and most of the days before that. She was not afraid now. She was awake. Elder Harmon spoke first, because it was his settlement, and he had held the silence for 22 years, and it was right that he be the one to end it. He told the assembled pack members what he had told Lena 2 days ago, more briefly, and with the slightly formal quality of a man making a public admission rather than a private confession. He told them about the woman who had died in the healing house with a child in her arms and a secret on her lips, and a terror that had been entirely justified by the history he had not known. He told them about the name and the foundling and the years of waiting that had been his private wait. There was silence when he finished. The particular quality of pack silence that was not empty, but full of the process of collective understanding. And then a woman in the crowd, one of the elder she-wolves whose opinion carried weight in the settlement, said, "The guardian blood is real. My grandmother's grandmother spoke of it. We thought it was a story." She paused. "It is not a story." The acknowledgement moved through the crowd like a current through water. One voice, and then another, and then more. until the thing that had happened became real in the way that things only became fully real when they were witnessed and named by people who mattered. Calder spoke after that. He spoke as the Alpha King, with the particular authority of a man who understood that his voice in moments like this was not personal but structural, not about what he felt, but about what the territory needed to hear established and confirmed. He spoke about the Guardian Line and the Iron Line and the bond between them, speaking from the record she had watched him read, giving the history its true shape, rather than the one that had been constructed over 300 years to replace it. He spoke about what Lena was. He did not speak about what they were to each other, not in the formal address to the assembled pack, because that was a different conversation, and he understood the difference between the public thing and the private thing, and the correct order in which they should be spoken. But when he was finished, when the formal address was done and the assembled pack had heard what needed to be heard, he turned and looked at her in the way he had been looking at her since the first morning, that full and direct and undeflected looking, and in front of everyone he extended his hand, and she looked at it for one moment, and then took it. And there was a sound from the assembled pack that she felt more than heard. A resonance. A rightness. The sound of something completing. The fox made its sound. The aurora had faded hours ago, but the morning sky above the frozen valley was the most vivid blue she had ever seen. The blue of deep winter clarity, the blue of seeing everything exactly as it is without any of the filters that fear applies to vision. She stood in the square of the settlement where she had grown up invisible, and held the hand of the man she had not known 3 days ago, and felt, under her feet, the pulse of the territory she was born to hold. And she thought about the word, enough. She had told herself for 6 years that her life was enough. She had been right, and she had also been wrong. It had been enough to survive. It had been enough to build something she was proud of. But this opening outward into fullness, this was something else. Not a replacement for what she had built, but an expansion of it. A revelation that the walls she had accepted as the limits of her life had not been walls at all but a chrysalis, and she had always been what was inside it. And now she was out. She looked at Calder. He was already looking at her. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said. And she could hear the thing in his voice that was not the Alpha King, and not the political structure, and not the careful control, but simply him, warm and certain, and pointed entirely at her. We have a great deal to learn about each other, and we have a territory to govern, and I suspect. His eyes moved briefly to the fox, who was sitting on his boot with an air of having achieved a life's ambition, that we will have a very opinionated advisor throughout. She felt the laugh before she heard herself make it, genuine and surprised, and the best thing she had felt in her chest in longer than she could measure. The pack around them shifted, settling. The sound of a community that had received news it needed, and was now reorganizing itself around a new truth. Elder Harmon wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his coat, and pretended he had not. Lady Vivienne, across the square, looked at Lena for a long moment, and then inclined her head, a small, precise gesture that contained more genuine respect than anything elaborate would have managed. And Lena returned it, with equal care. The wind from the valley came through the settlement gate, and brought the cold and the smell of ice, and the sense of distance and all the wide frozen territory that stretched from this small square to the edge of the world. She breathed it in. It was hers. It had always been hers. She was simply breathing it in as herself, for the first time. He was still holding her hand. She held his back. The fox purred against his boot. The morning light was extraordinary. In the weeks that followed, the North changed with the deliberate efficiency of a system that had been waiting for a missing component, and could now, finally, complete itself. It did not change easily, or without friction, because nothing real changed easily, or without friction, and there were those in the 7 territories who received the news of the Guardian bloodline's revival, with responses ranging from cautious welcome to active resistance. There were council meetings that required Lena's presence in rooms where people looked at her with the assessing eyes of those deciding whether to believe in something they had been taught not to believe in. And she faced these with the same quality of focused calm she brought to treating difficult wounds, understanding that the resistance was usually not personal, but structural, the difficulty of rewriting a story that had organized behavior for 300 years. She did her work. She was good at it. She discovered gradually that the guardian abilities were not only the territorial sense and the power she had felt on the solstice night, but something more operational, a capacity to understand the bonds of the pack structure, and to identify where they were stressed or broken, and to contribute to their healing in ways that were not always visible but were consistently effective. Calder watched her work in the council chambers with the same expression she had first seen on the morning with the fox, the wonder-adjacent thing, the evidence of a man encountering something he could not have predicted, and finding it better than anything he would have imagined. They learned each other in the way of people who are simultaneously building something new and discovering something that already existed. He showed her the Iron Citadel in the deep north, a place of severe and extraordinary beauty that the cold could not diminish, because it had been designed by people who loved the cold the way she loved the tundra, as a living thing rather than an obstacle. She found, when she arrived there, that it felt like the settlement healing house in the quality it had, the quality of a space that was shaped around a purpose and had been shaped truly, which made it feel inhabited in a deep way, rather than merely occupied. She felt in its walls the residue of the Iron Line, generations of people who had held this place and this territory with the same careful intensity she felt in Calder himself. And she understood that the feeling she had, standing in those halls for the first time, was the feeling of something recognizing itself. She expanded the healing facilities there, because they were inadequate, which he had known, and which had been waiting for someone to address with the right combination of skill and authority. She wrote to healers in Timai, other territories. She began training 2 apprentices. She maintained the work that had always been her anchor, and found that it was not less meaningful in larger circumstances, but more. Because now, when she healed a person, she felt it as part of the larger pattern she carried in her blood. One thread of the vast interconnected web of the North pulling back toward wholeness. Lady Vivian returned to the Eastern Territory, and, after a season, accepted a role as a territorial ambassador that played to her considerable intelligence and political sophistication in ways that the Queen's position, Lena suspected, would actually not have. She wrote once, a brief message delivered without ceremony, telling Lena that she had read the historical records on the Guardian bloodline that Calder had sent to all the territory libraries and had found them considerably more interesting than she expected. She did not say anything else, but the fact of the letter was enough. The white fox never left. It became, over months, a familiar presence in the Citadel, deeply unintimidated by every person and wolf it encountered, occasionally expressing opinions about council proceedings by sitting on important documents, deeply devoted to Lena in a way that had a completeness to it, as if it had been waiting for her its whole existence and was now very satisfied. Calder developed, Lena observed, a complicated and genuine affection for it that he was too dignified to fully express, and that revealed itself instead in his tolerance for the fox sleeping on his personal correspondence and his habit of directing remarks to it when he thought she was not listening. She found this unbearably endearing, and did not tell him so for 3 weeks, and then told him, and the expression on his face when she did was a thing she intended to keep. He was not, she had learned, a man who showed what he felt easily or often, but when he showed it completely. Without the practiced control he brought to everything else, and what was underneath it was so much warmer and more particular than the impression his public self gave, that the first time she saw it clearly, it had startled her into silence. He had noticed. He had asked her what was wrong. She had told him nothing was wrong, that she was only adjusting to new information. He had looked at her for a moment, and then said quietly, "I know." And the 2 syllables had contained everything. The claiming ceremony was held at the spring thaw, because the records indicated that guardian ceremonies had traditionally occurred at seasonal transitions, and because by spring there was no longer any political doubt about what was happening, and no longer any reason to wait for those who might still be resolving their own adjustment to the new reality. The 7 territories sent representatives. The ceremony was not the performance of anything new, but the public naming of what already was, conducted in the Great Hall of the Iron Citadel, with the aurora playing outside the high windows. Because the aurora, Lena had learned, tended to appear during significant moments in her life now, responding to something in her blood that she was still learning to understand. She stood in the circle of witnesses in the gown that had been made for her in the deep blue of the northern sky, the fox at her feet, and she felt the weight of the moment without being crushed by it, because she had spent months building the strength to hold it, and because the man standing across from her was looking at her with absolutely everything he was, and the person looking back at him was doing the same. He spoke the old words in the old language, the language that predated the pack structure, that she had been learning from the recovered texts, with the same systematic thoroughness she had once brought to learning medicinal herb preparation. And she spoke them back to him. And when the bond between them clicked into full completion, she felt it. Everywhere, not only in her chest but in her hands and her feet and the top of her head and the center of her bones. The mate bond settling into its full reality after months of building toward it. A thing that was not a constraint but the opposite. A foundation from which everything was more possible rather than less. The fox made the chirp hum sound, prolonged and resonant, filling the hall with something that sounded, to the assembled pack, like approval and recognition and the pure satisfaction of a very long task finally completed. There was a sound from the witnesses that built slowly. Not applause. Something more elemental. The sound of pack recognition, of the North acknowledging what was its own. She looked at him. He looked at her. Healer, he said quietly, just to her. Guardian. Alpha Queen. A pause, and she saw the not-quite smile she had come to know as his best expression of actual delight. Which would you prefer? I will answer to all of them, she said. But you may call me Lena. Lena, he said, as he had the first time, testing the weight of it. She had understood then, on some level she had not had the language for what that weight was. She understood it now completely. She was the weight. All of her. Everything she had been, and done, and survived, and built, and become. The healer, and the foundling, and the Omega, who had never been an Omega, and the guardian who had never known what she was. All of it, present, and accounted for, and chosen. By him, and by herself, and by the territory, and by the old blood in her veins that had waited 300 years for this exact moment. She had been afraid, not long ago, of what it would mean to revise her understanding of herself. She was not afraid now. What she had discovered was not a replacement, but an expansion. She was everything she had been, and also this. The woman who had built a life out of the material she was given and was proud of it, and the guardian of the North who held the heartbeat of the territory in her blood, and the mate of an alpha king who looked at her like she was the most important discovery he had ever made. She was all of these things simultaneously. She was complete. Outside the high windows of the Iron Citadel, the aurora moved across the deep winter sky in green and silver, and a faint, impossible gold, the colors of the North in celebration, the colors of something ancient recognizing its continuation. The territory pulsed, steady and alive, and she felt it. And it felt like the first breath and the last homecoming and everything in between. The fox purred against her feet. She held her king's hands in the circle of the completed bond and breathed and was exactly, entirely, herself. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?